The most embarrassing military disasters in history were not caused by the enemy. They were caused by the people who were supposed to be winning. And once you hear some of these stories, you will never look at the word professional army the same way again. We are talking about forces with every possible advantage, with numbers, weapons, supplies, experience, and sometimes even the higher ground, managing to lose, to darkness, to insects, to their own panic, to a rumor, to the weather, or to absolutely nothing at all. And the worst part is that these are not rare exceptions hiding in the footnotes. These are real events that shaped borders, ended dynasties, and changed the course of entire civilizations. History class handed us the clean version, the rehearsed version, the one where everything happened for a reason, and the right side usually won because they deserved to. But the raw version, the one underneath all that, sounds less like strategy and more like what happens when exhausted, frightened, overconfident human beings are handed weapons and told to figure it out. That version is what we are getting into today. And we are starting not with the biggest battle or the most famous name, but with the one that makes you stop and genuinely ask whether the people writing the history books just decided to leave the strangest parts out. Because some of what happened out there does not fit neatly into the story of honorable warfare and brilliant commanders. Some of it is chaotic, absurd, and almost impossible to believe. And yet every single thing in this video is documented, studied, and accepted as historical fact. No myths, no exaggerations. Just the real, messy, deeply human record of what actually went wrong, and how badly it went wrong, and how many people were absolutely certain they were doing the right thing right up until the moment everything fell apart around them. If you have ever watched something go sideways in slow motion and felt that horrible sensation of knowing exactly what is about to happen, but being completely unable to stop it, then you already understand the feeling that runs through every single story on this list. Welcome to the side of history they did not teach you. It gets strange very quickly. If this kind of history is exactly what you are here for, hit like and subscribe right now. It genuinely helps more than you think, and there is a lot more of this coming. So let us start with a story that sounds like someone pitched it as a film and got laughed out of the room for being too unrealistic. Picture this. A fortified compound sitting on a hill, surrounded by collapsing order, with the larger conflict it was part of, clearly, in its final days. Inside that compound are not soldiers. They are prominent public figures, political names, people whose capture was considered a prize worth holding on to. And now, with the structure of power crumbling around them and their captors fracturing into competing factions, the situation has shifted from captivity into something far more dangerous. Some of the guards who had been holding them have decided that a clean exit from history is no longer available to them, and they are willing to make that problem everyone else's problem too. The small defending force that assembles to protect the compound is something that should not exist by any conventional logic. You have soldiers from what had been, until very recently, opposing sides of the same conflict. You have the prisoners themselves, some of them elderly, some of them not especially fit, picking up weapons and choosing to fight rather than wait. You have local men and women from the surrounding area who have no military background, no uniforms, no training. Just the practical understanding that what is about to happen on that hill will affect everyone below it. These people hold a perimeter together through a sustained attack from a force that is ideologically committed and has nothing left to protect. They hold it. The compound does not fall. The people inside survive. And when it is over, the men who stood shoulder to shoulder defending that position go back to being, technically, on opposite sides of a war. The alliance lasted exactly as long as it needed to. It dissolved the moment the threat did. No ceremony, no monument built that afternoon. Just a strange, brief moment where the categories that defined the entire conflict simply stopped applying because survival had a more urgent agenda. What makes this story so difficult to process is not the fighting itself. It is the image of people who were enemies choosing, under pressure, to act like they were not. And the fact that it worked, because history does not often reward that kind of improvised cooperation. Usually it punishes the people who step outside the script. This time, just this once, it did not. Here is something that will genuinely keep you up at night. One of the most complete military collapses in recorded history was not caused by a superior enemy force. It was caused by a single whispered word that passed through a camp in the dark. No opposing army had fired a shot. No attack had been launched. The night was quiet, cold, and completely ordinary, right up until the moment it was not. And then, within the space of a few hours, a well-equipped force, with every numerical advantage imaginable, turned its weapons on itself and did more damage than any enemy had managed to do in the entire campaign leading up to that night. What you need to understand first is the size of this force. We are talking about thousands of men, trained men, men who had drilled, marched, and prepared for exactly this kind of operation. They had supply lines. They had experienced officers. They had a plan, and the plan was working, right up until a small forward group came back through the dark, and someone, nobody ever figured out exactly who, made a sound that someone else misread. A shout, maybe a warning, maybe just a name called too loudly in the wrong direction. The men nearby heard it and assumed the worst. And in the dark, when you are already tense and already tired and already aware that danger is somewhere out there in the black, the worst assumption spreads faster than fire through dry grass. Within minutes, units that had no communication with each other were firing in the direction of sounds they could not identify. The sounds they were firing at were their own men repositioning, retreating from the noise, calling out to each other in confusion, which created more noise, which triggered more fire. The feedback loop of panic fed itself perfectly, each wave of chaos producing the next one, until the entire formation had essentially dissolved into a dark, screaming, desperate mass of men who no longer knew where their own lines were. By the time any kind of order was restored, the damage was real and documented. The enemy, the actual enemy they had marched out to face, had not been anywhere near them. They arrived later, looked at what had happened, and walked into a situation that had already been decided by fear and darkness and one bad moment of miscommunication. That is the part that refuses to leave you. The enemy did not break that army. The army broke itself completely. In the dark. Because one person made a sound at the wrong moment and nobody had a system in place to stop the assumption from spreading. There is a particular kind of horror in that, which has nothing to do with warfare and everything to do with how human minds behave when the information they have is incomplete and the stakes feel total. We fill the gap with the worst available option, every time. It is not cowardice. It is just how we are built. And armies, for all their training and structure, are still made of the same material. Now here is where it gets even stranger, because the next story takes everything that just happened and flips it into something that almost feels like dark comedy, except that real people paid the price for it. If the previous disaster was an army destroyed by imaginary danger in the dark, this next one is a city that declared open conflict against something that turned out not to exist at all, in broad enough light that everyone should have known better. It started with a report, specifically a report that something was moving through the sky over a populated coastal area. The atmosphere was already thick with tension, the kind of tension that settles into a place after a major shock and refuses to lift. The kind where every shadow looks like it has weight, and every unexplained sound gets your heart into your throat before your brain can catch up. So when the report came in, nobody stopped to ask the obvious questions. Nobody said, "Let us wait and confirm this." The order went out, the lights went off across the city, and then the guns opened up. You have to picture what that actually looked, sounded, and felt like from street level. The entire sky above a living city full of ordinary people suddenly lit up with anti-aircraft fire. The sound was enormous. A continuous rolling thunder that rattled windows and shook the ground and made the air itself feel unstable. People who had been asleep ran into streets that were pitch black because of the blackout orders. Cars moved without lights and hit things. The physical shock of the noise alone caused medical emergencies among people who had no idea what was being fired at. And what was being fired at, as far as investigators were later able to determine, was the sky itself. The leading explanation that eventually emerged pointed toward atmospheric objects, the kind that float, drift, and reflect light in ways that tired, frightened observers with searchlights tend to read as something more threatening than they actually are. More than 1,000 rounds went into the air above that city. The guns fired for hours. And when the morning came and the smoke cleared, and people started asking what had been hit, the answer was essentially nothing. The city had spent an entire night at war with weather and its own collective imagination, dressed up in the uniform of an enemy attack. Several people died, not from any incoming threat, from the chaos the response itself created, crashes, accidents, the physical toll of sustained fear at a population scale. The enemy, in this case, never showed up. The city did the damage to itself. 2 stories in a row now, where the most destructive force on the field was the one that was supposed to be in control. And we are barely getting started. A fully armed naval fleet was captured by soldiers on horseback. Not boarded from the water, not surrounded by a superior naval force. Captured by men on horses who simply rode across the frozen surface of the water and approached the locked ships from underneath, from the ice itself. From the one direction no naval defense plan in history had ever seriously accounted for. And that is only one of the 2 stories in this section. The other one involves insects. So let us take these one at a time because both of them deserve the full picture. The fleet situation happened during a brutal winter when a body of coastal water froze solid enough to hold the weight of mounted soldiers moving at speed. The ships were locked in place, their hulls gripped by ice that had formed around them overnight. The crews were not helpless. They had weapons, they had numbers, they had the physical advantage of height looking down from the decks. But the one thing they did not have was the ability to move. And in any confrontation, the side that cannot move has already lost something fundamental before the first exchange happens. The soldiers came across the ice in the early morning, when the light was thin and flat, and the frozen surface stretched out pale and silent in every direction. There was no dramatic cavalry charge, no thundering hooves and battle cries, just the quiet, steady sound of horses moving carefully across ice, closing the distance to ships that could not retreat, could not maneuver, could not do the one thing warships exist to do. The crews watched them come. That image alone, standing on the deck of a warship and watching soldiers on horseback approach you across water that is turned to stone, is the kind of thing that does not compute fast enough for anyone to respond effectively. The fleet surrendered, the entire thing, captured not by a superior naval force, but by winter, and by a commander who looked at an impossible situation and asked the one question nobody else had thought to ask, which was simply, what if we just walked across? Now here's the part where nature stops being a passive obstacle and starts acting like it has a personal opinion about the whole thing. A large force lands on hostile territory with a significant numerical advantage and a straightforward objective. The terrain is unfamiliar, but manageable. The opposition is smaller and less equipped. On paper, this is the kind of operation that gets written up as a clean success in the debrief. What the paper version never accounts for is the ground itself, specifically what lives in it. The advance moves into dense vegetation, the kind that holds heat and moisture and blocks sound in ways that make distance impossible to judge. And then, something in the undergrowth reacts to the vibration and the noise and the disturbance of thousands of boots moving through territory that was not designed for them. What came out of that vegetation hit both sides without any preference or loyalty whatsoever. The invasion column broke. Not from enemy fire, not from a flanking maneuver, but from pain and confusion and the complete inability to maintain any kind of formation while under that kind of assault. The defending force, smaller, more familiar with the terrain, managed to regroup faster. The larger force did not. The retreat that followed was not tactical. It was biological. The environment had cast its vote, and the vote was unanimous. What connects these two stories is something that keeps surfacing throughout this entire list, which is the assumption that the battlefield is a neutral space that simply holds the two sides while they resolve their disagreement. It is never neutral. It has temperature and weight and seasons and things living in it that were there long before any army arrived and will be there long after. Every commander who forgot that paid for it in a way that no amount of training or numbers could offset. The next story takes this idea and twists it even further because it is not about the environment winning. It is about a commander who figured out how to make the enemy's own mind do the work for him. The most effective attack in this entire list did not use a single weapon. It used a belief. Specifically, it used the enemy's belief against them, and it worked so completely that the position fell without the kind of sustained fighting that should have been required to take it. Here's the setup. A well-defended position. A force behind those defenses that is organized, motivated, and connected to a set of cultural and spiritual convictions that run deep enough to influence how they make decisions under pressure. The attacking commander knows this. He has spent time understanding not just the physical layout of what he is up against, but the internal landscape of the people defending it, what they value, what they would hesitate to destroy, What image or symbol, placed in the wrong position at the wrong moment, would make a trained fighter pause for just a fraction of a second longer than they should? And in a confrontation, a fraction of a second is everything. The approach he designs does not lead with the strongest part of his force. It leads with something that offenders cannot respond to cleanly. Something that sits right on the edge between a legitimate target and something they are culturally conditioned to protect. The hesitation this creates is small, a beat, a breath, the kind of pause that looks like nothing from the outside, but internally represents the moment when a person is running two completely contradictory instructions at the same time and cannot execute either one properly. That pause is what the attack is built around. The strike comes into that window, and the window is wide enough. The defense collapses faster than the numbers alone would suggest it should. The position falls, and the commander who designed it never had to match the enemy's strength for strength, never had to absorb the cost of a frontal engagement, never had to spend what a conventional approach would have required. He won by understanding that the most load-bearing structure in any defense is not the wall or the weapon. It is the certainty of the person holding it. Remove the certainty, and the wall does not matter anymore. The reason this story sits so uncomfortably alongside everything else on this list is that it is not a story about incompetence. Every other disaster we have covered so far involved someone making a catastrophic mistake, panicking, misreading information, or simply getting unlucky with the environment. This one is different. This is a story about someone doing something genuinely brilliant, and the feeling it leaves you with is not clean admiration. It is something more complicated than that, because the weapon he used was not invented in a forge or a workshop. It was built from observation, from patience, from the willingness to look at another group of human beings and identify the precise point where their deepest convictions make them vulnerable. That is a different category of dangerous entirely. And what comes next on this list is going to take that discomfort and push it somewhere even more unexpected. Two armies fought a full battle, took real casualties, and spent real lives on a conflict that had already been resolved on paper before the first shot was fired. The peace agreement existed. It had been signed, witnessed, and sealed. The war was legally over. But the word had not arrived yet, and in that gap between the ink drying and the messenger reaching the field, men died for something that had already been declared finished by the very people who sent them there. This is not a metaphor. This is not a dramatic way of describing some political gray area. The documents were signed. The conflict was done. And because information in that era moved at the speed of a horse on a bad road, nobody on either side of that field knew it. So they fought. They fought hard. The way people fight when they believe the outcome genuinely matters, because as far as anyone standing in that field could tell, it did. The force that won that engagement celebrated afterward with the kind of energy that comes from a real, hard-earned victory. They had taken casualties. They had pushed through resistance. They had done exactly what was asked of them, and they had succeeded. And the bitter, almost unbearable irony is that their celebration was completely genuine and completely pointless at the same time. The battle they had just won did not change a single term of the peace agreement. It did not shift any border. It did not recover any territory. It did not alter the political outcome by one word. because the political outcome was already fixed. The commanders who sent those men forward did not know that. The men who followed orders and crossed that field did not know that. The ones who did not come back from it never got the chance to find out. What this story exposes is something that keeps appearing in different forms throughout this entire list, which is the gap between the reality on the ground and the reality being managed somewhere else. The people making the large decisions and the people carrying them out are almost never looking at the same picture at the same time. In most cases, that gap produces confusion or inefficiency. In this case, it produced a battle that should never have happened, mourned by families who had no idea the sacrifice was already unnecessary before it began. There is no clean lesson to extract from that, no tidy observation about better communication or faster messengers that makes it sit easier. Some of the weight in history is just weight. It does not resolve into meaning no matter how long you look at it. And yet the side that won walked away with a story they told for generations, a proud, defining story about courage and victory and holding the line. All of it true, all of it real, and all of it built on top of a foundation that, if they had known the full picture, might have made them put down their weapons and go home before any of it started. Now, if that story made you feel the particular discomfort of watching something tragic unfold in slow motion, the next one is going to hit you differently, because it is not tragic at all. It is almost pure comedy, except that the comedy in question has been running for centuries and shows absolutely no sign of stopping. We have talked about armies destroyed by panic, by nature, by the environment, by their own assumptions, and by a peace deal nobody knew about. This next story is about a conflict that history remembers almost entirely because of one absurd object that got attached to it like a barnacle and refused to let go. The actual political situation behind this clash was complicated. There were rival factions, territorial pressures, shifting loyalties, and the kind of layered regional tension that takes a full chapter to explain properly. None of that is what anyone remembers. What everyone remembers is the object. A container. A simple, ordinary, completely unremarkable storage container that one side took from the other during the conflict, and then, rather than returning it as part of any settlement, kept, deliberately, publicly, as a statement. The losing side wanted it back. The winning side refused. And that refusal, that petty, deliberate, almost childish act of holding on to something that had no real military or strategic value, became the defining image of the entire episode. It outlasted the political analysis. It outlasted the names of the commanders involved. It outlasted any serious attempt to discuss what the conflict was actually about. Because a simple object held up in triumph communicates something instantly that a detailed explanation of factional politics never quite manages to land with the same force. It says, "We beat you, and we are not going to let you forget it, and we are going to use the least impressive possible trophy to make that point forever." The winning side leaned into it completely. They did not downplay the object or try to redirect attention toward the more serious dimensions of what had happened. They embraced it. They let it become the symbol. And by doing that, they made a choice, whether they understood it at the time or not, to let the joke be the monument. And here's the thing about that choice. It worked. Centuries later, The object is still the first thing anyone mentions when this conflict comes up. The complicated political reality faded. The symbol stayed. Which raises the question that connects this story directly to everything that came before it in this list. We keep assuming that history preserves what was most important. But what this story proves, quietly and with a kind of stubborn humor, is that history preserves what was most vivid. And sometimes the most vivid thing in the room is not the strategy or the sacrifice. Sometimes it is just the thing someone refused to give back. A commander with 13 ships looked at a fleet that outnumbered him so badly, the ratio does not even feel real. And he chose to fight anyway. Not out of desperation, not because he had no choice. He chose it deliberately, with a clear head and a specific plan. And what he pulled off that day sits in a category almost entirely by itself in the whole recorded history of naval warfare. But let us not start at the victory. Let us start at the moment before it, because that moment is the one that tells you everything about who this man actually was. His fleet had been reduced through a series of losses and setbacks that would have convinced most commanders to pull back, regroup, and wait for a more favorable situation. 13 vessels. That was what remained. The water around him that morning was cold and gray, the kind of cold that settles into the wood of a ship and makes everything feel heavier than it is. And the incoming fleet was visible on the horizon as a dark mass that kept growing as it approached. The officers around him understood the numbers. Everyone understood the numbers. And yet, he did not call a retreat. What he called instead was a meeting, and in that meeting he explained exactly what he intended to do and why he believed it would work. The strait they were positioned in was narrow, genuinely narrow. The kind of waterway where the geography itself starts making decisions for you whether you want it to or not. A large fleet moving through a confined channel cannot spread out. It cannot use its numerical advantage properly because the width of the water simply will not allow it. The ships at the front of the column are the only ones doing the actual fighting. The hundreds behind them are passengers, unable to reach the engagement, unable to contribute, essentially decorative at that stage. He had seen this. He had measured it. He had built his entire plan around that one geographic fact, and he positioned his 13 ships across the narrowest point of that strait and waited. The incoming fleet entered the channel with the full weight of its numbers pressing from behind, which meant the front ships were being pushed forward faster than ideal, into a space that was already getting complicated. Currents in that strait were fierce and unpredictable, the kind that pull at a hull sideways and make steering exhausting, even in calm conditions. The larger ships, heavier and less maneuverable, felt this more than his did. They started losing clean formation. The front of the column compressed. Ships that were supposed to be fighting were spending energy just holding position against the water. And then he hit them. Not with superior firepower, not with numbers, with timing, with the current used as an ally, with the chaos of a compressed formation that could not respond cleanly to an attack coming from a force that knew exactly where it was going and why. Ships in the incoming fleet began colliding with each other as the fighting at the front disrupted the spacing behind it. The confusion spread backward through the column faster than any order could travel forward, and his 13 ships held their position across that strait and did not break. When it was over, the result was so lopsided that historians looking at it later have repeatedly gone back to the primary sources to make sure the numbers were recorded correctly. They were. What this commander understood that his opponent did not is something that keeps appearing in different forms across this entire list. Advantage is not the same as control. Having more does not mean being able to use more. The geography was always going to determine how much of that fleet could actually fight at any given moment. And the commander who understood the geography owned the battle before it started. The next story starts from the exact opposite position, and that contrast is what makes it so satisfying and so painful at the same time. Instead of a brilliant mind turning nothing into everything, this is the story of a fully equipped, properly resourced, technologically superior force handed a simple task and watching it become one of the most expensive non-achievements in the history of organized embarrassment. A single unmanned craft went off course. That was the entire problem. One machine, no pilot, no hostile intent, just a malfunction sending it drifting over populated airspace in a direction nobody had authorized. The solution should have been straightforward. Scramble interceptors, locate the craft, bring it down. Done. The interceptors went up. They located the craft without difficulty. It was not hiding. It was not maneuvering. It was not doing anything except drifting on a predictable path at a consistent altitude, completely indifferent to everything happening around it. And then the interceptors opened fire. What followed is one of those sequences that sounds made up until you track down the documentation and find that every detail is confirmed and on the record. The pilots expended their full complement of unguided rockets. Not some of them, all of them. Every single round they had carried up with them was fired at a slow, non-maneuvering, unarmed, unpiloted object moving in a straight line. The hit rate was so low it barely registered as a statistic. The rockets that missed the target, which was nearly all of them, continued on their own trajectories and found other things to hit instead. Ground fires started. Structures were damaged. The people living below the flight path spent a significant portion of that afternoon dealing with the consequences of a military response that was functionally aimed at them rather than at the actual problem. And the craft they had been sent to destroy was still airborne. It had not been touched in any meaningful way. It continued on its drift, unbothered, while below it the landscape processed the aftermath of the attempt to stop it. Eventually, with no assistance from anyone, it simply ran out of whatever was keeping it moving and came down on its own in an uninhabited area. The machine solved its own problem by stopping. The humans who had been sent to solve it first had spent a significant budget of hardware and generated a significant amount of collateral disruption and achieved a result that was, by any honest measure, worse than if they had done nothing at all. There is a specific flavor of institutional failure that this story represents, and it is different from everything else on this list. The armies that destroyed themselves in the dark were victims of fear and bad information. The fleet that could not use its own numbers was defeated by geography and a smarter opponent. But this is something else. This is a modern, well-funded, professionally trained force, failing at a task so contained and so simple that the failure cannot be explained by circumstances. It can only be explained by the gap between what an institution believes about its own capability and what that capability actually looks like when tested against a problem with no room to hide in. That gap is uncomfortable to look at directly, and the next story on this list is going to make that discomfort even harder to avoid. The last invasion of a particular stretch of coastline ended not with a dramatic battle, but with a group of armed men surrendering to people who were not soldiers, had no military authority, and were mostly just annoyed that strangers had shown up uninvited. And that is the generous version of what happened. The full version is even harder to take seriously. Except that it is completely real, and every embarrassing detail of it is documented. The force that arrived on that coastline came with a genuine strategic objective. The plan was not stupid on paper. Land, make contact with any local dissatisfaction that could be stirred into open resistance, create enough disruption to embarrass the ruling power, and use that disruption as leverage. It was the kind of operation that had worked in other places under other conditions, and there was at least a theoretical logic to attempting it here. The problem began almost immediately after the landing. The force had been assembled from a mix of sources, and the cohesion that a combined unit needs to function under pressure was not there in the way the planners had assumed it would be. Within hours of coming ashore, the discipline that should have held everything together started showing visible cracks. Some of the men drifted away from their assigned positions. The local landscape, wet and unfamiliar and nothing like what they had prepared for, started working against morale in the quiet, persistent way that bad terrain always does. The smell of damp earth and salt air, and the sound of wind coming off the water in gusts that made communication difficult, all added to a growing sense that this was not going how anyone had expected. And then the locals showed up. Not soldiers, not an organized defensive force with orders and a chain of command. Just people from the surrounding area who had heard that something was happening on their coastline and had come to see about it. They came with farm tools and hunting equipment and the particular kind of unhurried determination that belongs to people defending the place they actually live in, which is a very different energy from soldiers following orders on unfamiliar ground. The invading force, which had arrived expecting to find either a vacuum of resistance or organized sympathizers ready to join them, found instead a community that was simply not interested in being invaded and was prepared to communicate that position physically if necessary. There was a moment, and you can almost feel it in the historical record, where the balance tipped, where the invaders looked at what was in front of them and then looked at what was behind them, which was open water and no clear way back to anything resembling safety or support, and the calculation changed. The surrender that followed was not the result of a military defeat in any conventional sense. There was no decisive engagement, no strategic position overrun, no commander outmaneuvered. The invasion simply ran out of the belief that it could work. And once that belief was gone, there was nothing left to hold the operation together. The locals accepted the surrender with the kind of practical efficiency that suggests they had not been particularly impressed by any of it. The most striking detail in the whole episode is not the surrender itself. It is the speed. From landing to surrender, the entire invasion covered a span of time so short it barely registers as a military campaign. It is more accurately described as an arrival and a fairly quick reconsideration. The last time that coastline was approached by a hostile force with serious intentions, it ended like this. Not with a great battle that people would retell for generations. With a damp, tired group of men handing over their weapons to farmers and local residents who had better things to do with their afternoon. Now, everything we have covered so far, the self-destruction, the panic, the institutional failure, the absurd surrenders, has one thing in common. Each story involves a force that had a real chance and squandered it, or a force that was overwhelmed by something outside its control. But the next story is in a completely different category, and it sits there alone, because it is not about failure at all. It is about success so audacious, so unreasonable, so far outside what any sensible analysis would have predicted, that it almost loops back around and becomes its own kind of absurdity. A force of fewer than 200 men walked into a situation where the opposing side numbered in the thousands. Not hundreds of thousands, not tens of thousands, thousands. And the 200 won, not by luck, not by some external factor swooping in to tilt the balance, by design. The man who led that force had spent time before the operation studying not the military strength of his opponent, but the rhythm of how that opponent moved through the world. When they gathered, how they arranged themselves in large numbers, what the difference was between the way they behaved in a ceremonial context versus a combat context, and crucially, how long it would take that many people to shift from one mode to the other once something unexpected happened. He built his entire plan around that transition time, the gap between surprise landing and organized response was the window he needed. And he calculated it carefully enough to believe he could work inside it. The approach was made in a way that looked, from the outside, like something formal and non-threatening, the kind of arrival that does not immediately read as an attack because it does not fit the shape of what an attack is supposed to look like. By the time the shape of what was actually happening became clear to the people on the receiving end, the window was already open and the plan was already moving. The physical assault, when it came, was concentrated, fast, and aimed at a single objective. Not the destruction of the larger force, just the capture of its leadership. One person. Because this commander understood something that most military thinking of his era did not fully account for, which is that a force of thousands, held together by the authority of one person, becomes a very different thing the moment that person is no longer free. The chaos that followed the capture was not manufactured, it was structural. It was the natural consequence of a system built around a single point of authority, losing that point without warning or preparation. The thousands did not fight as thousands anymore. They fragmented. And the fewer than 200, who had planned for exactly this, moved through the fragmentation with a focus that the larger force could no longer match. When it was over, the outcome was so complete that people who study it still argue about whether the word brilliant is strong enough. What this commander proved is that the most efficient path through a large obstacle is not always the one that goes through the middle of it. Sometimes it is the one that goes straight to whatever is holding the whole thing up. Remove that, and the obstacle removes itself. No enemy was present, and over 100 men still died. That is the sentence that defines the next story, and no amount of context makes it easier to sit with. We have moved through tales of armies that panicked in the dark, cities that fired at empty skies, forces that collapsed under the weight of their own assumptions, and one extraordinary commander who bent probability until it broke in his favor. But this next story strips away all the external factors, all the weather and terrain and cultural psychology, and leaves something much starker. A disaster with no enemy involvement whatsoever, produced entirely by the machinery and the men who were supposed to be operating it. The night was cold and heavily overcast. the kind of sky that presses down on the water and makes distances impossible to judge correctly. A formation of vessels was moving through coastal waters in conditions that required exact timing and exact communication between every unit in the column. The exercise they were conducting was not combat. It was preparation for combat. The kind of large-scale coordinated movement that requires everyone to know their position, their speed, and the position of every other vessel around them at all times. What happened instead was a sequence of errors so precisely timed in their accumulation that it almost defies the mathematics of bad luck. The first miscommunication created a gap in the formation that nobody in the middle of the column could see clearly enough to account for. A vessel adjusted its course to compensate for something it had incorrectly read. And that adjustment put it on a line that intersected with the path of another vessel moving in the opposite direction. The collision that resulted was not dramatic from a distance. The sound carried across the water, a deep, grinding impact that anyone who has heard metal meeting metal under load would recognize immediately. But by the time the vessels around it processed what had happened, the chain reaction was already starting. Ships that were moving at speed in low visibility began emergency maneuvers. And those maneuvers put them into the paths of other ships doing exactly the same thing. The water that had been dark and quiet was suddenly full of signals and shouting and the sound of hulls under stress. 2 vessels went down. Others were damaged badly enough to take them out of any future operation for an extended period. More than 100 men died in water cold enough to take them quickly once they were in it. Not from enemy fire, not from a tactical decision that went wrong, from a sequence of small errors that locked together in the dark like pieces of a mechanism nobody had designed, but that assembled itself perfectly in the space of a few terrible minutes. The investigation that followed was thorough and produced findings that were, in their own way, as uncomfortable as the event itself. Because what the investigation found was not one catastrophic mistake made by one identifiable person. It found a system, a set of procedures and communication habits and training assumptions that had a gap in it, a gap that had been there all along, unnoticed, because nothing had ever gone wrong in exactly the right sequence to fall into it. Until that night. That is the part that makes this story different from a simple accident. Accidents happen because of individual failures. This happened because of a structural gap that the institution did not know it had. And institutions that do not know where their gaps are cannot protect against them. Because you cannot guard a door you do not know exists. The men who died that night were not failed by one bad decision. They were failed by a system that looked complete from the outside and had a hole in it that only became visible when everything went through it at once. The next story also involves something hidden becoming suddenly and dramatically visible, but it arrives from a completely different direction. And the feeling it produces is almost the opposite of what we just described. Where the previous disaster was cold and mechanical and impersonal, this one has the quality of something almost theatrical, something that feels, even with historical distance, like the moment the sky decided to participate in what was happening on the ground below it. 2 separate commanders, 2 separate engagements, both faced with the same situation. An unusual visual event in the sky directly above the battlefield, visible to everyone on both sides simultaneously, carrying no inherent meaning, but landing in the middle of thousands of people who were already primed to read everything around them as a sign. The first commander saw it happen and felt the energy shift through his own ranks the moment it appeared. You could hear it move through the formation, a collective sound somewhere between awe and unease. The kind of sound a crowd makes when it sees something it cannot immediately explain. The men closest to him turned their faces upward, and the ones who were not near enough to ask questions just followed the gaze of those who were, until the whole formation was looking at the same thing in the sky and waiting for someone to tell them what it meant. And that was the moment. Not the event itself, but the silence after it, the waiting. Because in that silence, the meaning was still unwritten, and whatever he said next was going to fill it. He did not hesitate. He turned to face his men, and he gave the event a name and a purpose that fit exactly what they needed to hear at that moment. He told them it was a confirmation, that what they had just seen above them was the sky itself declaring whose side it was on. He said it with the kind of certainty that has nothing to do with whether you personally believe it, and everything to do with understanding that the people listening to you need something solid to hold on to right now. The effect was immediate and visible. The unease converted. The men who had been looking at the sky with uncertainty were now looking at their commander with something that functions as the military equivalent of ignition. That changed event became a symbol he carried forward and used deliberately for the rest of his campaign. He had it reproduced and displayed in ways that reminded his men in every subsequent engagement that the sky had spoken for them. The second commander in a different era faced the same atmospheric event, but under opposite circumstances. His side was not stabilized by a strong central figure who could move fast enough to own the interpretation. The event landed in both formations equally, and what happened next depended entirely on which side could process it faster and attach a coherent meaning to it first. Neither side managed to do that cleanly, and the result was that both forces effectively paused. The mutual hesitation created a space that neither had expected, and out of that space came a negotiation that ended the immediate conflict. Two armies stopped fighting because the sky went strange, and nobody could agree on what to do next. That outcome sounds almost too neat to be real, but it is documented, and the astronomical calculation that confirmed the timing of the event is part of what makes this story stick. The universe did not take sides that day, but two commanders in two different centuries both learned the same lesson from similar moments. The battlefield is never just the ground beneath your feet. It is everything your soldiers can see, hear, and feel in every direction. And the commander who understands that has a weapon that cannot be counted in any inventory. The hardest part of this next operation worked perfectly. Every single element of the difficult, dangerous, months-long preparation succeeded exactly as planned. And then the easy part arrived and destroyed everything. We have talked about commanders who turned impossible odds into victory through intelligence and patience. We have talked about systems with hidden gaps that only reveal themselves at the worst possible moment. This story is different from both of those, because it is not about a gap in the system, and it is not about a brilliant mind finding an angle nobody else saw. It is about the specific and almost unbearable irony of watching a genuinely extraordinary achievement become the foundation for a genuinely catastrophic failure. The preparation took months. A team of specialists worked underground, literally underground, digging a passage beneath the enemy's defensive position, in conditions that would make most people reconsider the entire career. The tunnel ran for a significant distance through soil that shifted and compressed and occasionally threatened to collapse the whole thing on top of the people working inside it. The air down there was thick and close and tasted of damp earth and effort, and the men doing the digging had to remove everything they excavated without making noise that could be detected from above. They worked in rotation, sleeping in short intervals, eating in the dark, measuring their progress by feel as much as by sight, because the light available to them was minimal and precious. When the tunnel was finally complete, it was a genuine engineering achievement. Not in the celebrated sense, not in the way that gets a plaque or a public acknowledgement. In the quiet sense of men who had done something extraordinarily difficult and done it correctly. The charge placed at the end of that tunnel was calculated to do one specific thing: open a breach in the defensive line large enough and sudden enough to create a moment of real vulnerability in the position above. When it detonated, it did exactly that. The ground opened. The position above was thrown into chaos. A gap appeared in a defensive line that had held for months. And on the other side of that gap, ready and waiting, was the force that was supposed to pour through it and exploit the advantage that had just been handed to them at enormous cost and effort. What happened next is the part that military historians return to repeatedly because it represents such a complete and specific failure of human judgment under pressure. The leading elements of the attacking force reached the edge of the breach, and then, instead of moving around it and through the flanks of the disrupted position, they went into it, directly into the crater that the explosion had created. The crater was deep and steep-sided, and once men went into it, they found that getting back out under any kind of resistance was far harder than going in had been. The formation that was supposed to flow through the gap pooled in the hole instead. Units stacked up behind units. The commanders who should have been directing the movement forward were instead dealing with a press of men who had lost the shape of the plan the moment the ground in front of them looked different from what they had rehearsed. The defending force, which had been genuinely stunned by the explosion and had genuine reason to believe the position was about to break, watched this happen and began to recover. They moved to the edges of the crater and fired down into it. The breach that had been a door became a trap. The attack failed with significant casualties. The tunnel, the months of dangerous work, the careful calculation, the successful detonation, all of it had produced the exact opportunity it was supposed to produce, and the humans who were supposed to walk through that opportunity looked at it and chose the one response that guaranteed it would close on them. What this story proves is something no amount of planning can fully account for. You can engineer a perfect moment. You cannot engineer the decision a person makes when they are standing inside that moment, and the noise is overwhelming, and the ground looks different from how it looked in the briefing. The next story takes the idea of a disaster that was baked in long before the final moment and stretches it across an entire expedition, months of travel, thousands of miles of open water, and a series of increasingly clear signals that everything was going wrong, all of which were ignored by the institution responsible, until the ending arrived and made ignoring it impossible. A large fleet set out on a journey that was, from a logistical standpoint, already at the edge of what was realistic. The distance involved required the ships to travel through multiple bodies of water in varying weather conditions, with supply chains that depended on arrangements that were not always in place when the fleet arrived to use them. The hulls began accumulating growth from the first weeks of travel, the kind of biological fouling that slows a vessel progressively and invisibly until it is carrying a significant handicap that does not show up in any single day, but compounds over weeks into something that affects every aspect of performance. The men on board felt the changing rhythm of the ships without necessarily being able to name what was causing it. Everything was slightly harder than it should have been. The vessels responded a little more slowly. The sense of weight and drag was not dramatic, but it was constant, like wearing boots that are just slightly too heavy, something you adjust to without realizing how much energy the adjustment is costing you. Morale followed a similar trajectory. In the early weeks, there was still the energy of departure, the forward momentum of a force that believes in its own objective. But that energy has a natural lifespan, and when it runs out, it needs to be replaced by something. What replaced it on this expedition was not confidence or renewed purpose. It was a creeping collective awareness that things were not going according to the picture that had been drawn for them at the start. And then came the incident that, in any honest assessment of this expedition, should have triggered a serious command-level reassessment of the entire operation. Moving through waters that were nowhere near the conflict zone they were heading toward, with visibility poor and nerves frayed after weeks of difficult travel, the fleet encountered vessels that did not match any known threat profile for their actual enemy. They were fishing boats, working vessels, people doing ordinary things in waters they had every right to be in. The fleet opened fire on them. The reasoning, reconstructed afterward, was that someone in the darkness had convinced themselves that the vessels had a threatening profile, and that the enemy had somehow positioned assets in waters that were geographically implausible for that purpose. The attack caused real harm to people who had nothing to do with the conflict, created a diplomatic incident that the expedition's supporting institution then had to manage from a distance, and did not slow the fleet's journey by a single day. They simply continued. As if what had just happened was a navigational error rather than a signal that the stress and isolation of the journey had already degraded the judgment of the people making decisions on those ships. When the fleet finally arrived at its destination, it was in the condition that months of fouled hulls, poor supply, compressed morale, and at least one serious lapse in judgment had produced. Which is to say, it was not the fleet that had set out. It was a diminished, tired, compromised version of that fleet, wearing the same flags. The engagement that followed was swift and devastating, and was decided in a matter of hours. But as we said at the start of this story, the ending was never really decided at the destination. It was decided in all the weeks before, in every decision that was made or avoided, in every signal that was received and not acted on. The fleet that arrived to fight had already been defeated by its own journey. The battle was just the moment when that fact became official. Civilians showed up to watch a major battle with food in their hands and absolutely no idea they were about to become part of it. Not soldiers, not military observers with credentials and a safe distance. Ordinary people, some of them carrying wrapped meals, some of them in their good clothing, who had traveled out to a position close enough to the engagement to watch it unfold as though a battlefield were a venue with seats. The conflict had been building for long enough that everyone in the surrounding area knew it was coming. And because the opening engagement was expected to be decisive and relatively quick, because the dominant public feeling was that the whole thing would resolve itself neatly and soon, a remarkable number of people decided that the appropriate response was to come and observe in person. There were political figures in that crowd. People whose professional role involved making decisions about the very conflict they had come to watch. There were journalists with notebooks. There were residents who had simply heard that something significant was happening nearby and felt that proximity to significant events was its own kind of participation. The mood in that crowd, at least at the start, had the texture of anticipation rather than fear. The distant sounds of the engagement carried across the open ground, and people watched the movement of formations through the haze with the detached interest of people observing something that is happening to other people in a context that does not yet feel personal. Then the shape of the battle changed. The side that was supposed to hold its position did not hold it. The pressure that had been building at the front of the engagement broke through in a way that nobody in that crowd of observers had factored into their afternoon. The retreat that followed was not organized. It was not the kind of disciplined withdrawal that looks from a distance like a deliberate repositioning. It was a collapse, fast and spreading, the kind that moves through a formation like a current and carries everything in its path in the same direction. And the direction it was moving was directly toward the road that the civilian observers were standing on, watching. The crowd that had arrived as an audience became part of the retreat in a matter of minutes, not because they were ordered to move or organized into any kind of response, because the retreat simply reached them and folded them into itself. Wagons that had been carrying supplies were now moving at speed on the same road as people who had come out for the afternoon with food in their pockets. The sounds changed from distant percussion to something immediate and close and impossible to misread. The orderly scene dissolved into a single mass of movement heading away from the battlefield. Military and civilian completely mixed together, both operating on the same basic instruction, which was to put distance between themselves and what was happening behind them. The journalists who had come to record a clean, decisive victory found themselves writing about something that had no clean edges at all. The political figures who had been observing from what they assumed was a safe and informative distance found that the distance had evaporated and that the information they were now receiving was entirely physical. What this moment represents is something that goes beyond the specific military failure at the center of it. The civilians on that road had made an assumption that turned out to be structurally identical to the assumption made by the force that broke in front of them. Both groups had decided in advance what the day was going to be, and had made their plans around that decision. Neither group had built in any serious accounting for the possibility that the situation would refuse to match the picture they had drawn of it. The battle shattered the illusion for the military force in tactical terms. It shattered it for the civilians in personal terms. And the road back carried both groups together in a retreat that was, in its own way, one of the most honest moments in the entire conflict. Because it contained no performance and no pretense. Just people moving fast away from something that had turned out to be very different from what they expected. There is a particular kind of battle that history remembers not because of how long it lasted, but because of how much weight it carried in the time it took. Everything we have covered in this list has involved hours, days, months of buildup, of preparation, of slow-moving consequences accumulating into something that finally breaks the surface. But occasionally history compresses everything, the stakes, the consequences, the turning point, into a window so short it barely registers on a clock. And the two stories that close this list are exactly that kind of event. The first one lasted under 20 minutes, from the moment of engagement to the moment of collapse. A force positioned near a river was caught in a condition of genuine vulnerability. Not through incompetence, not through a failure of planning in the way we have seen repeatedly throughout this list. Simply through the timing of an attack that arrived at the exact moment when the camp was between its states of readiness, not yet fully alert, but no longer fully at rest. The attacking force had moved into position during the night. The approach had been made in a way that the terrain assisted, keeping the movement quiet and the profile low until the distance had closed to a point where surprise was still fully intact. When the strike came, it came fast, from multiple directions, into a camp that had no time to organize a coherent response. The collapse of resistance was almost immediate. Within minutes, the structure of the defending force had broken down to the point where it was no longer functioning as a unit. Individual men were making individual decisions about what to do next, and none of those decisions involved holding the position. The commander of the defending force was captured shortly after, found at some distance from the engagement, the circumstances of his discovery adding a final layer of deflation to an already complete collapse. Everything that followed from that capture, the negotiations, the political agreements, the redrawing of arrangements that affected people far beyond the two forces involved in those 20 minutes, flowed directly from the speed and completeness of what had happened on that riverbank. 20 minutes. That is all history needed to move something very large in a very new direction. The second closing story is different in texture, but identical in its essential lesson. A military approach that had been dominant for years, that had won engagement after engagement and built a reputation so solid it had started to function as a deterrent on its own, was destroyed not in a long, grinding campaign that wore it down over time, but in a single afternoon. The defending force was preparing to set up the formation that had made it so effective for so long. The setup required time and specific conditions, a particular arrangement of terrain and position that the formation depended on to function. The attack came before that arrangement was complete. Not by a wide margin, by a narrow one. But narrow was enough. The attacking force moved at a speed that the defenders had not prepared for, targeting the gaps in a formation that was partially assembled and therefore partially blind. The men who were supposed to anchor the defense had not yet reached their positions. The men who had reached their positions were exposed without the support that the formation required to work. The reputation that had made this approach seem almost magical turned out to have been entirely dependent on the conditions being right. When the conditions were not right, the reputation offered nothing. It could not fire a weapon or hold a line. By the time the afternoon was over, the approach that had defined an entire period of military thinking was broken in a way it never fully recovered from. Here is what all 18 stories in this list have in common when you look at them together from the end. Every single institution, every commander, every force that failed in this list failed at the same thing. Not strategy, not resources, not numbers or technology or terrain. They failed at the moment when reality offered them a picture that did not match the picture they already had in their heads. The ones who could update the picture in time survived. The ones who could not, did not. That is not a military lesson. That is a human one. And the question that this entire list leaves sitting in the room is one I want you to think about before you answer it in the comments. Which disaster on this list do you think was the most avoidable? And what single decision, changed at the right moment, would have flipped the outcome completely? Think carefully before you answer, because the way you answer that question says something about how you think about failure in general. If this list made you think, made you laugh, or made you genuinely angry at the sheer waste of it all, hit like and subscribe. There is a lot more history where this came from, and none of it is the version they put in the textbooks.